The finality of the orphanage gate closing behind her was not a clang of liberation, but the dull thud of a tomb being sealed. Ilara stood on the cracked pavement, a thin wool coat pulled tight against a wind that already carried the scent of autumn's decay. In her hand, she clutched a manila envelope, the sum total of her 21 years in the care of the state. Inside was a meager bundle of cash, barely enough to last a week, and a deed. The document, brittle and yellowed with age, was for a piece of land her grandfather, a man she knew only from a single, faded photograph, had left in a will discovered decades too late. The matron had handed it to her with a look of pity that felt sharper than any insult. "It's all that was left," she had said, her voice devoid of warmth. "A scrap of rock up in the Whisperwind Peaks. Probably worthless, but it's yours." A joke, Ilara thought, a final cruel joke played by a world that had never offered her more than scraps. The locked gate was the definitive act, the physical manifestation of her expulsion. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The journey was a slow stripping away of civilization. The bus groaned up winding mountain roads, its passengers thinning at each small forgotten stop, until only she remained. The driver, a man with a face like a worn map, watched her in the rearview mirror as she disembarked at a crossroads, marked by a leaning, weather-scoured sign that read, "Stonewake." He had pointed a thumb towards a barely visible track, disappearing into a forest of skeletal aspens and dark pines. "Your grandfather's place is up that way, a long walk. Nobody's been up there in 50 years. He did not wish her luck. He simply engaged the gears and left her in a cloud of diesel fumes, and a profound ringing silence broken only by the mournful voice of the wind combing through the high branches. The isolation was immediate and absolute. Denk. Ma. Send. Every step she took on that rutted path, her cheap suitcase bumping against her leg, felt like a step away from everything she had ever known, meager as it was. The air grew colder, thinner, carrying the metallic tang of snow. When she finally saw it, the despair that had been a cold knot in her stomach threatened to consume her entirely. The matron's word, worthless, was a kindness. The cabin was a ruin, a skeleton picked clean by time and weather. The roof had collapsed into a ragged V, exposing the dark, damp interior to the sky. One wall had crumbled into a pile of moss-covered stones, and the remaining timbers were silvered and splintered, leaning at a drunken angle. The landscape was no more forgiving. It was a harsh canvas of gray. Rock-stunted pines twisted into tortured shapes by the relentless wind and the rust-colored bracken of a dying season. This was not a home. It was a grave. She dropped her suitcase, the sound swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence. For a full day, she did nothing. She sat on a cold boulder, watching the clouds scud across the vast empty sky, a tiny, powerless figure in a landscape that promised only hardship and a slow, cold end. The wind whispered its threats, a constant, sibilant predator circling her small island of misery. Giving up felt like the only logical choice, a simple surrender to the inevitable. The second day dawned gray and colder still. A fine, needle-like sleet began to fall, and the paralysis of despair gave way to a shivering reality. As she huddled in the lee of the ruined wall, her eyes fell upon a single stubborn wildflower growing from a crack in the foundation stone. It was a tiny, defiant splash of purple against the overwhelming gray, its petals beaded with ice. It was impossibly alive, in a place of death. Something in that small, tenacious display of life broke through her stupor. A memory surfaced vague and dreamlike of a man's voice, her grandfather's perhaps, from a story someone once told her. "The stone holds the heat," the voice echoed in her mind. "The earth remembers the summer." The words were meaningless, yet they stirred something within her. The sorrow and self-pity that had frozen her began to curdle, hardening into a cold, sharp-edged anger. An anger at the matron, at the world, at the sheer insulting worthlessness of her inheritance. She would not die here. She would not give them the satisfaction. The decision was not a surge of hope, but a grim, bitter refusal to be erased. Fooled by this new brittle resolve, she began to work. The labor was a balm, a way to quiet the screaming panic in her mind. She started with the simple, methodical task of clearing the debris from inside the cabin's remaining footprint. She hauled fallen timbers, her hands quickly blistering, and tossed aside chunks of sodden plaster and roofing. It was mindless, grueling work. But with each stone she moved, she felt a sliver of agency return. She was not just a victim of this place, she was acting upon it. As she cleared the area around the great central hearth, a massive structure of river stone that was the only part of the cabin still fully intact, her foot snagged on a loose floorboard. Annoyed, she kicked at it, and the rotten wood splintered, revealing a dark cavity beneath. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Prying away the rest of the boards, she uncovered not a simple crawl space, but a small, stone-lined compartment. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth and nestled in a bed of dried herbs, was a heavy, ledger-style journal and a sealed metal box. She carried the items to the shelter of an overhanging rock, her hands trembling as she untied the oilcloth. The journal's leather cover was stiff and cold, embossed with a simple compass rose. She opened it. The pages were filled with a dense, elegant script, accompanied by meticulous hand-drawn diagrams that were more engineering schematics than simple sketches. It was her grandfather's voice, not in memory, but on the page. Clear and intelligent. He wrote not of feelings, but of principles, of thermodynamics, of geology, of the physics of heat and cold. He called the cabin his great experiment. The journal was a manual. It detailed the construction of the massive stone hearth, revealing it was not a simple fireplace at all. It was a cacophon, a masonry heater, designed with a complex, labyrinthine system of smoke channels that extracted nearly all the heat from the wood smoke before it ever reached the chimney. It was designed to be fired hard and fast for only an hour or two, and then the immense thermal mass of the stone would radiate a gentle, steady heat for the next 24 hours. It was a battery for warmth. The revelation was a physical shock, a jolt of understanding that chased the cold from her bones. This wasn't a primitive hearth, it was a sophisticated piece of thermal engineering. The second part of the journal detailed the cellar, which she now realized was the compartment she had just uncovered. It wasn't just a space, it was a geothermal storage unit. Dug deep into the earth and insulated with layers of gravel, sand, and moss, it was designed to maintain a constant cool temperature year-round, drawing on the stable temperature of the deep earth. The small metal box contained the key. Inside, carefully packed in grease, were specialized tools, flue cleaning brushes of specific sizes, a strange-looking mortar trowel, and a set of heavy iron dampers with precise fittings. There were also packets of seeds for cold-hardy vegetables and detailed instructions on how to create a winter garden within the semi-subterranean foundation of the collapsed wall, using the radiant heat from the cabin floor and a covering of salvaged glass. It was a complete, self-contained system for survival, a masterpiece of quiet ancestral genius that defied every conventional notion of pioneer living. The ruin was not a ruin, it was a blueprint. Her plan, born from the pages of the journal, would have seemed like madness to any outsider. She would not rebuild the cabin in the conventional sense. The collapsed roof and walls were not a failure, but an opportunity. She would embrace the earth. She would excavate the interior, sinking the living space partially below ground level, using the earth itself as insulation. She would rebuild the one collapsed wall with stone and sod, and construct a low, steeply pitched roof, framed with salvaged timbers and covered in layers of earth and moss, a living roof that would hold the snow for even greater insulation. The centerpiece, the heart of it all, would be the restoration of the great masonry stove. It was an audacious, almost insane undertaking, for one person with limited tools and no experience. But the journal was her guide, its precise instructions a catechism against despair, She now saw the landscape not as an enemy, but as a resource. The collapsed wall was her quarry. The clay soil by the creek was her mortar. The forest was her fuel and timber, a week into her labor. A figure on horseback appeared on the ridge. He was a thick-set man with a florid face and an air of unearned authority that clung to him like cheap cologne. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, the chairman of the Stonewike Town Council. He surveyed her work, the growing pile of sorted stone, the deepening pit of the cabin floor, with an expression of open disgust. "The old orphanage matron radioed down about you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Send you up here to die, did she? This is no place for a girl. You'll be frozen solid by first snow." He gestured with his riding crop at the massive stone hearth. "You'll need a quart of wood a week to feed that monster, and it'll still suck all the heat up the chimney. You need a modern iron stove, sealed tight. Efficiency, that's the key." Ilara, her hands raw and her face smudged with dirt, simply looked at him. "I have a plan," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Blackwood let out a short, barking laugh. "A plan, child. Your plan is to dig your own grave. Come winter, the White Death will come down from these peaks, and it won't care about your plans." His certainty was absolute, his arrogance a suffocating blanket. "When you're ready to give up and beg for a room in town, find me. Try not to freeze before then." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving his laughter hanging in the cold air. His mockery did not wound her. It solidified her resolve into something as hard and unyielding as the granite she was learning to split. The labor was a brutal, all-consuming thing. Each day was a litany of aches that settled deep into her bones. She rose before dawn, her muscles screaming in protest, and worked until the last light failed, her body fueled by dried rations and a relentless, burning purpose. She used the sturdy timbers she had salvaged as levers to move stones far too heavy to lift, a slow, patient process of leverage and force that her grandfather had detailed in his journal. She dug clay from the creek bed, her feet numb in the icy water, and mixed it with sand and dried grass to make mortar, pounding it with a heavy stone until her arms felt like lead. Her hands, once soft, became a roadmap of calluses, cuts, and blisters that broke and bled and healed into thickened pads. She learned the language of the stone, how to read its grain and find the fault lines where a well-placed blow from her sledgehammer would split it cleanly. She was not just building a shelter, she was remaking herself. The soft, vulnerable girl who had arrived at the ruin was being chipped away, revealing a core of resilient strength she never knew she possessed. Her dwindling supplies eventually forced her to make the long trek into Stonewike. The town was a small, grim cluster of buildings huddled in the valley. The general store was its heart, a dim, cluttered space that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and coal smoke. The man behind the counter was old, with a face as gnarled as an oak root and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He introduced himself as Silas. He listened without expression as she laid out her list. Bags of cement to patch the stove's firebox, a new axe head, flour, salt, beans. "That's a lot of credit for a stranger," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Blackwood was in here yesterday. Said you were digging a hole to die in." Ilara met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Blackwood is wrong." She explained her plan. Not the intimate details from the journal, but the general principle: rebuilding the great stove, sinking the floor, using the earth. Silas stroked his gray beard, his eyes appraising her calloused hands and the fierce, exhausted determination in her face. He was silent for a long time. "An old way," he finally said, more to himself than to her. "My own grandfather talked about heaters like that, said they had a different kind of warmth. A slow warmth." He looked at her again. "Blackwood's a fool who thinks money can buy wisdom. He just installed a new oil furnace the size of a wagon. Boasts it can heat his whole mansion in a blizzard. He turned and began gathering her supplies. "I'll run you a tab. Pay me when you can." It was not an act of charity, but of recognition. In her he saw not a foolish girl, but the echo of an older, quieter form of knowledge, and he was willing to make a small wager on it. With fresh supplies and a renewed sense of purpose, Elara returned to her work. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The first frosts silvered the landscape each morning. The reconstruction of the stove was the most critical task. Following her grandfather's diagrams, she painstakingly cleaned the intricate network of internal flues, pulling out decades of squirrel nests and debris. She used the cement from silas to repair the firebox, a job that required her to crawl deep into the cold, dark heart of the structure. Then came the mortar work, chinking every stone on the exterior, sealing every possible crack against the coming cold. She felt an intimate connection to the man who had designed it, his forethought and intelligence present in every carefully angled flue and every precisely fitted damper. She was not just following instructions. She was in dialogue with him across the decades. As she worked, she could almost feel his presence, a quiet, encouraging spirit, guiding her hands. The stove was no longer just a pile of rocks, it was a promise. It was the heart of her new world, and she was its surgeon, carefully, methodically bringing it back to life. As the stove was being reborn, she excavated the earth. The hole in the cabin deepened, the packed dirt walls rising around her. She dug until the floor was 5 feet below ground level, a sunken pit that felt protected, primal. She lined the dirt walls with a barrier of fieldstones, leaving a gap that she filled with dry moss and bracken for insulation. Another technique from the journal. She rebuilt the collapsed northern wall, the one that would face the brunt of the winter winds. Not with timber, but with the stones from the ruin, creating a wall 3 feet thick. The roof was the final, desperate push against time. She muscled the salvaged timbers into place, creating a low, steep frame. Over this, she laid a bed of thick pine boughs, followed by the preserved oilcloth from her grandfather's cache. And then finally she shoveled on a thick layer of the excavated earth and covered it with sod. Her home was now a low mound on the landscape, a part of the hill itself, with only a single deep-set window and a heavy plank door facing south. It was a hobbit hole, a den, a fortress against the coming storm. The harbinger arrived on the radio. Silas had insisted she take a weather bulletin, crackling with static, interrupting the tinny music. It was a storm of historic proportions, a Siberian express plunging down from the Arctic, promising record-low temperatures and blizzard conditions for at least 3 days. The announcer's voice was grave. He called it the White Death, the same term Blackwood had used with such derision. In Stonewyke, a quiet panic set in. People boarded up windows and piled firewood on their porches. Mr. Blackwood, smug and secure, gave an interview to the local radio station, boasting about his state-of-the-art oil furnace and his backup generator. He spoke of the town's resilience, but made a pointed, pitying remark about the poor, foolish girl up on the peak who was surely doomed. He made her a public object lesson in the folly of ignoring modern, conventional wisdom. Elara felt no panic. As the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf, she moved with a calm, methodical purpose. She had already gathered her fuel, not a massive woodpile, but a modest, carefully selected stack of dense, seasoned hardwood. She brought the last of her supplies inside, bags of flour, beans, and the few hardy vegetables she had managed to grow in her small protected patch. She checked the stove's dampers one last time, ensuring the seals were tight. Then, following the journal's instructions, she built a fire in its deep, cavernous firebox. Not a slow, lazy fire, but a roaring, ferocious blaze that she fed with log after log for 2 solid hours. The stove consumed the wood with incredible efficiency, the flames roaring up the primary channel with a sound like a jet engine. The exterior of the stone monolith remained cool to the touch. When the prescribed 2 hours were up and the wood had been reduced to a deep bed of glowing coals, she closed the heavy iron dampers, sealing the heat and the carbon monoxide safely within the stove's stone guts. Then she waited. The first snowflakes, hard and granular like salt, began to skitter across the dirt roof. She retreated inside, barred the heavy door, and lit a single oil lamp. In Stonewyke, the storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked through the valley, driving snow horizontally, piling it into monstrous drifts that buried cars and blocked doorways. The power grid, burdened by thousands of electric heaters, flickered and died within the first hour. The town was plunged into darkness and a terrifying deep cold. Families huddled around their ironwood stoves, feeding them constantly, but the heat was a fleeting thing. It rose directly to the ceiling, leaving the floors icy, while drafts, like invisible fingers of ice, crept in through every crack in the walls and window frames. The stove devoured wood at an alarming rate, and the carefully stacked cords on porches began to shrink with terrifying speed. Fear, colder than the wind, began to settle over the town. They were in a battle of attrition against an enemy that did not tire. In his sprawling modern house on the edge of town, Mr. Blackwood was initially unconcerned. His backup generator had kicked on, powering the lights in the massive oil furnace. He sat in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, listening to the storm rage outside with a sense of profound satisfaction. He was prepared. He was intelligent. He had invested in the best technology, but as the first day bled into the second, a problem emerged. The wind was so ferocious and the cold so intense, 30 below zero then 40, that the furnace, for all its power, could not keep up. It ran constantly, burning through its 1,000-gallon tank of oil at a prodigious rate. Cold spots appeared in the large, airy rooms. The wide picture windows, his pride and joy, became vast sheets of interior frost. By the third day, the generator sputtered and died, its fuel line frozen solid. The house went dark. The furnace went silent. And the profound, invasive cold of the mountain began to seep into his palace of modern convenience, turning it into a vast, luxurious icebox. Meanwhile, in her earthen shelter, Alara experienced the storm as a distant, muffled roar. The snow piled deep on her living roof, burying her small home completely, transforming it into a silent, insulated cocoon. The wind howled harmlessly over the mound of her dwelling. Inside there was no fire. The firebox of the great stove was dark and cold, but the stone itself was alive. It radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the small subterranean space. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a soft, steady, encompassing heat like the warmth of the sun on a spring afternoon. The air was fresh and still. The temperature a constant, comfortable 68 degrees. She had baked bread on the stove's heated stone shelf the day before, and the scent still lingered. She sat at her small handmade table, reading her grandfather's journal by the calm, steady light of her oil lamp. She had food. She had water from melted snow. She had a deep, profound, and absolute safety. While the world outside was being torn apart by the White Death, she was secure in the warm, beating heart of the mountain. On the fourth day, the wind died. An eerie, brilliant silence fell over the landscape. The world was transformed, buried under a seamless blanket of white, the sky a painful crystalline blue. In Stonewyke, the slow work of digging out began. The toll of the storm was severe. Houses had frozen pipes, livestock were lost, and the town's fuel reserves were almost entirely depleted. The story of Mr. Blackwood's failure was the talk of the town. His mansion was a frozen mausoleum, its pipes burst, its fine furniture ruined. He had been forced to take shelter with his neighbors, a humiliating ordeal for a man of his pride. It was then, in the midst of his own disgrace, that his thoughts turned with a cold certainty to the girl on the mountain. If his modern marvels had failed so spectacularly, her primitive hovel must be a tomb. Driven by a mixture of civic duty and a morbid need to see his prediction proven correct, he gathered a small party of men. The journey up the mountain was an arduous post-apocalyptic trek through chest-deep snow. It took them half a day. They found not a cabin, but a snowdrift, a perfect uninterrupted mound of white. Blackwood felt a grim, hollow sense of vindication. She was gone, buried. As they got closer, however, one of the men pointed. A thin, almost invisible curl of gray smoke was rising from a small stone chimney pipe that barely cleared the snow. It was not the thick, bellowing smoke of a desperate roaring fire, but a pale, lazy wisp, as if from a fire long since banked confused. Blackwood floundered through the snow to where he estimated the door should be. He began to dig frantically with his gloved hands. After several minutes, he uncovered the top of the heavy plank door. He pounded on it, his fist making a dull, muffled sound. "Hello, is anyone in there?" he shouted, his voice hoarse. The bar on the other side scraped back, and the door swung inward, opening into a space of impossible warmth. Elara stood there, framed by the soft lamplight. She was wearing a simple wool shirt, her cheeks flushed, her expression calm and questioning. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. The air that wafted out of the doorway was a shock to the system, a soft, warm, breathable cloud that smelled faintly of baked bread and dried herbs. Blackwood stared, dumbfounded. He stepped inside, and the sensory contrast was dizzying. Outside was a world of blinding white and lethal cold. Inside was a sanctuary of gentle warmth and peaceful golden light. The stone walls were warm to the touch. The air was still and comfortable. There was no roaring fire, no shivering huddle, no sign of hardship at all. He looked from her serene face to the massive, silent stone stove. "How?" he stammered, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only raw, baffled disbelief. "Your fire, it must be enormous. Where is all your wood?" Elara looked at the great stone structure that dominated the room. She placed a hand on its warm flank. "I last built a fire 3 days ago," she said, her voice clear and even in the quiet space. "It burned for 2 hours. Blackwood's mind simply could not process the information. It violated every principle of survival he understood. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You would have frozen in hours." Elara gave him a small, sad smile, the smile of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a difficult student. "You think of heat as a fire you must constantly feed," she explained. "My grandfather taught that heat is a thing you can store. An iron stove throws all its heat into the air, and the wind steals it. This stove gives its heat to the stone. It fills the stone like a bucket, and for the next day, the stone slowly, gently lets it go." She patted the warm rock again. "The earth remembers the summer," she said, quoting the phrase that had sparked her journey. "And the stone remembers the fire long after the flame is gone." The men who had accompanied Blackwood stood in stunned silence at the doorway, witnesses to the miracle. When they returned to Stonewike, the story spread like wildfire. It was a tale of 2 systems, 2 philosophies. The story of Blackwood's loud, expensive, modern failure, and the story of the orphan girl's quiet, ancient, and profound success. Blackwood's humiliation was total and public. He had not only been wrong, but his arrogance had made him a town-wide symbol of foolishness. He had boasted and postured, and the quiet girl in her earthen den had proven him a fool, with nothing more than stone, clay, and forgotten wisdom. His authority evaporated. He became a laughingstock, the man whose mansion froze while the gravedigger basked in warmth. Within a month, he sold his property at a loss and left Stonewike, unable to bear the weight of his own shattered worldview and the town's pitying, knowing glances. The perception of Alara shifted overnight. She was no longer the foolish, pitiful orphan. She became a figure of awe, then of respect. People began to make the trek up to her small home, not with pity, but with questions. They brought gifts of food and tools, not as charity, but as offerings. At first, they were hesitant, but Alara welcomed them with a quiet grace. She showed them the journal. She explained the principles of thermal mass, of passive solar gain, of geothermal insulation. She held nothing back. The knowledge her grandfather had preserved was not hers to hoard. It was a legacy to be shared. She became a teacher, her small, warm cabin, a classroom where the hard-won wisdom of the past was offered to a future that desperately needed it. The transformation of the community was slow but profound. The following summer, several families, with Lara's guidance, began building masonry heaters in their own homes. They retrofitted their houses with better insulation, dug deep root cellars, and oriented new constructions to take advantage of the sun. They were relearning a language of resilience that their grandparents had known, but that the age of cheap, convenient energy had caused them to forget. The town, humbled by the White Death, began to look inward to its own history and its own resources. For strength, it became more self-sufficient, more robust, and more connected to the rhythms of the harsh and beautiful land it occupied. The arrogance of the modern was replaced by a respect for the durable. Years passed. Alara's earthen home remained, a testament to her initial struggle and ultimate triumph. Her hair was now streaked with gray, but her eyes held the same quiet, determined light. Her grandfather's journal sat on a place of honor by the stove, its pages soft and worn from 1,000 viewings by the people of the valley. She had taken a worthless inheritance, a joke of a property, and unearthed a fortune far greater than money. She had found a lifeline, not just for herself, but for an entire community. Her legacy was not written in laws or etched onto monuments, but built into the very hearthstones of the town, a living warmth that would endure for generations. The world is full of shouting, loud voices proclaiming new, better, faster ways, promising easy solutions and technological salvation. They build great, gleaming houses of glass that cannot stand against the wind, and they mock the simple strength of the stone. But there is another kind of knowledge, a quieter wisdom that sleeps in the earth and is written in the forgotten journals of those who came before. It is a wisdom that understands that resilience is not about fighting nature, but about understanding it. That true warmth comes not from a raging, consuming fire, but from a slow, steady, and patient heart. The greatest strength is often found not in what is new and loud, but in what is old, overlooked, and willing to listen to the whisper of the stone over the roar of the wind.